Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something exceedingly slow and flat and oddly shaped. No, not your dreams, though those are probably on life support by now, but the oddly dignified evolution of Venice's most famous aquatic lounge chair, the gondola. Now, I should warn you, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dangerous. Oh no, quite the opposite. You're going to fade gently into oblivion somewhere between oar placement and waterline curvature. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin, of course, in the marsh. Not an exciting marsh, not a dramatic, fog-drenched marsh where secrets are hidden and willows weep. This marsh doesn't even have a name. It's just soggy, somewhere in the murky flatlands of what would eventually become Venice. A few pragmatic folks stand around wondering how to get from one side of a puddle to another. Not enough ground to build on, not enough depth for big ships. So someone, not a visionary, just someone who didn't feel like getting wet, flattens a few planks, curves the ends a little, and pushes off gently into the shallows. No ribbon cutting, no music swelling, just a shrug and a squelch, long before the word gondola existed. Venice's ancestors used flat-bottomed craft for simple, marsh-based tasks, hauling fish, avoiding mud, checking crab traps. The bottom was designed without a keel because, really, a keel in this slush would be like wearing high heels on a trampoline. And yet, this practical beginning is exactly what birthed the gondola's most defining feature, its ability to skim over barely there waterways without tipping, dragging, or complaining. Modern gondolas are 8.5 meters long, but their humble ancestors were far shorter, more squat, more likely to sink if you sneezed. There's very little written about these proto-gondolas. No one painted them, no one described them in poetic verse. In fact, most historians agree that the lack of early documentation is precisely what proves they were so ordinary. You don't document your wheelbarrow, you just use it. But slowly, softly, these early boats were altered. The planks became lighter. The hull grew longer. The shape began to stretch like a cat waking up. Nothing sudden, nothing urgent. But by the time Venice began rising out of the lagoon in the 9th and 10th centuries, boats were already adapting to its unique challenge, how to be a city without land. The gondola's eventual elegance has roots in this bland necessity. Buildings were constructed atop pilings, driven deep into the mud. Streets were water, alleys were canals. A boat wasn't optional. It was your bicycle, your bus, your front porch. This made flat-bottom design not just convenient, but essential. No hole could be too deep, no boat too wide. In fact, archaeological finds show dozens of similar craft designs across northern Italy during the medieval period, but none adapted quite like Venice's. One quirky fact about those early boats: they were sometimes fitted with retractable keels, wooden inserts that could be dropped when waters were deeper, then pulled back up for shallow canals. It's like having training wheels you could politely tuck away when your crush walked by. Another oddity, despite being used daily by nearly everyone in the region. There was no official term for these vessels until centuries later, people called them barche boats, or sometimes by more specific task-related names, like pieta for cargo craft. The word gondola didn't appear in writing until around 1094, in a letter by Doge Vitale Falier, and even then, he didn't explain it. This is where scholarly confusion quietly seeps in, like water into old floorboards. Some believe the term derives from the Latin cymbula, meaning small boat. Others argue for a Greek origin, possibly condura, a term used for narrow ships with flat sterns. Still others shrug and say it's just a Venetian thing, like glass-making and political intrigue. The scholarly debate isn't exactly heated, more room temperature. Most agree the term became more standard as the boat itself took on more symbolic weight. By the 14th century, it had become unmistakably the boat of Venice, but even then, it was still undergoing changes, quiet ones, of course. And here's the mainstream fact to round off our floaty beginnings. Venice's early canals weren't engineered. They were natural channels that happened to stick around. Human influence came later, when people began reinforcing canal edges with stone and regulating water flow with tide gates. But in the very beginning, it was all trial and sogginess, and the boats just a clever workaround for living in a swamp. You pass a wooden dock now, really just a few logs lashed together and partially sinking. Someone in a woven tunic is trying to nudge a boat loose with a long pole. It's not romantic. It's not elegant. It's mud and mild frustration and the occasional splash of a boot. And yet, it's working. The canal you're drifting along isn't particularly wide. In fact, it's barely the width of two boats side by side, assuming both gondoliers are feeling generous. It's quiet, still, not because the city isn't alive, but because this particular waterway is meant for passing through, not for showing off. This is where design begins to adapt, not because anyone holds a symposium about boat dimensions, but because people keep bumping into things. As Venice began to grow in the 13th century, its neighborhoods, called sestieri, multiplied like particularly ambitious water lilies. More homes, more bridges, more routes winding like veins across the lagoon. And with that came a new challenge. You could no longer sail your little flat-bottomed craft straight through town without 1,000 awkward turns. Enter the long, narrow boat. No one issued a decree about it. No blueprints were passed around with signatures and seals. It just started happening. Wide boats got stuck more often, turned slower, collided with produce barges. And in a city where shouting was considered impolite and honking didn't exist, the solution had to be structural, so gondolas got slimmer, longer. They stopped being rectangular and started tapering toward the ends, which made turning easier and gave the whole thing a bit more grace, although again, no one was really trying to be graceful. They just wanted to stop scraping against things. One mainstream fact tucked into this phase of change by the late 13th century. Venice had enacted its first official canal traffic regulations. They weren't complicated, mostly just speed limits, yes, really, and rules about who had the right of way under bridges, which, if you're wondering, was usually the one already under the bridge, though not always. Venetian law had its own poetic ambiguity. By this point, boats had become a part of daily rhythm. They weren't just for merchants and fishmongers. People used them to commute, gossip, nap, propose marriage, or escape from small talk. Families even had their own favorite gondoliers. The boat wasn't just transportation, it was a floating living room. And yet, the word gondola still didn't mean what it does today. It referred to a general class of boats, some larger, some with sails, some used for specific events or noble families. The narrow passenger gondola you're picturing right now, that was still quietly assembling itself like a sleepwalking puzzle. Here's where the fringe fact slips in. While most historical records describe these boats as narrow out of necessity, some lesser known sources suggest that early gondolas were intentionally asymmetrical to assist in turning through tight spaces. In other words, they weren't just long and narrow, they were a little lopsided, which brings us to a soft. Scholarly disagreement was the boat's asymmetry a happy accident of craftsmanship, or was it intentional all along? Some historians argue that as gondoliers developed the technique of rowing on one side, boat builders naturally adjusted the hull to compensate. Others believe the boats were built asymmetrically first, and that rowing technique came after. It's a quiet, academic chicken and egg debate. As you glide forward now, under a low stone bridge streaked with algae, you hear the light clunk of a gondola's prow brushing the edge, a soft mutter, a quick nudge with the oar, and everything continues, as if the collision never happened. That's how design worked in Venice by bumps and scrapes, not by manifesto. Gondolas adapted like cats, growing longer to fit narrower boxes. Each shift in shape was so slight you wouldn't notice unless you compared a boat from this century with one from the last. In workshops tucked away in side canals, called squarey, boatwrights worked mostly by feel. A curve here, a tilt there, nothing written down, nothing precise. And yet, slowly, the boats changed. Some modern engineers marvel at how stable these early gondolas were, despite being long and increasingly narrow. They rarely tipped. That's thanks to a surprisingly complex underbelly, a shallow V-shaped hull hidden beneath what looked like a flat deck. It wasn't deep enough to interfere with canal navigation, but it added just enough stability to keep passengers upright, even when they shifted their weight. And here's a little secret from the past. Those boat builders weren't always sober. Several records, not scandalous ones, just municipal notes, casually mention how wine was an unofficial workplace tradition, which means your gondola may have been slightly asymmetrical because the builder was too. You pass another gondola now. The gondolier doesn't wave, he doesn't nod, he just eases his oar into the water, adjusts the angle slightly, and glides by. There's a quiet etiquette on the canals, a non-verbal choreography. No need to speak if everyone knows the dance. Even the materials began to shift. Lighter woods, thinner planks, fewer iron bolts. The goal was always the same, a boat that floated like an afterthought and turned without complaint. You could drift the length of a canal without touching anything, if you knew what you were doing, and if you didn't, well, you learned quickly. You hear it before you see it, a gentle splash, rhythmic and unhurried. One oar dips into the water, then arcs silently through the air, again and again. No splashy theatrics, no showy turns. Just a man, or occasionally a woman, standing tall at the stern of a gondola, rowing from one side only. At first glance, it looks inefficient, even a little lazy, but it's not. It's deliberate, and more importantly, it works, especially in a city made of corners. Rowing standing up might sound like a novelty today, but in 14th century Venice, it was a quiet revolution, not born of flair or drama, but out of practicality. Sitting to row meant poor visibility in tight spaces. Sitting also meant less leverage and more guesswork. The city's canals were crowded, uneven, and winding like a child's doodle. You needed height, you needed visibility, and you needed to keep your hat dry. So, up they stood. This new posture led to a new technique, rowing with a single oar on the starboard side. The oar rested in a unique wooden forcola, a sort of sculptural oarlock with grooves and ledges that allowed the gondolier to pivot and push in several directions with one smooth motion. And here's the most mainstream fact about this moment in gondola evolution: no rudder was needed. The gondolier became the rudder. By slightly twisting the blade of the oar in or out of the water, they could change direction mid-stroke. Turning a boat 8 meters long with a single oar while standing at one end might sound like a circus trick, but here it was just Tuesday. There's something calming about the simplicity. Gondoliers didn't yell out commands. They didn't need a crew, just the rhythm of push and glide, timed with the city's quiet pulse. Interestingly, this rowing technique didn't come with manuals or training schools at first. It was passed down person to person. Apprentices watching older gondoliers, copying their stance, mimicking their angle. The only diploma was muscle memory. Now for the oddball detail, one of those little gems that survives mostly through gossip and fragmented diary entries in the 1500s. There were gondoliers who became minor celebrities, not for their skill, but for singing while rowing. But these weren't dramatic serenades. They were lullaby-paced songs about the weather, fish prices, or their favorite kinds of cheese. One famous gondolier, known only by his nickname, Cencio La Voce, reportedly had a steady rotation of melancholic tunes about falling into canals on purpose, just to cool off. The idea of singing gondoliers later evolved into tourist entertainment, but in its earliest form, it was simply a way to pass time, a soft hum against the lap of water, not meant for applause, just there. And the scholarly debate in this section whether this stand-up rowing technique truly originated in Venice or was adapted from other regional traditions. Some historians argue that similar styles existed on the Po River or in Dalmatian coastal towns. Others insist Venice refined and standardized the technique independently. The evidence is sparse, and nobody's arguing with much energy. But the question lingers like mist off the canal. Back in your drifting journey, you pass a gondolier now. He's older, with a weathered straw hat and a scarf tied around his throat, like it's midwinter. Even though the air is warm, his feet are planted wide. One hand grips the oar. The other rests lightly on the edge of the boat. He barely looks up as he turns the corner, carving the water like a pen across paper. You might think it's graceful, and maybe it is, but to him, it's just the usual way of getting from A to B without falling in. The design of the forcola, remember that sculpted oarlock, also deserves quiet applause. It isn't just functional, it's a piece of art. No two are exactly alike. Each is hand-carved from walnut or cherry wood, adjusted for the gondolier's height. preferred stroke angle, and even handedness. The four-cola supports multiple positions for the oar, allowing quick shifts between rowing straight, braking, reversing, or even spinning in place, all with one tool, all without drama, and yet you'll rarely see one outside a boat. They're so specialized they look like abstract sculptures when removed from context. And they sort of are. Museums in Venice display them on white pedestals now, alongside oil paintings and ceremonial glass. You pass a boatyard where half a gondola rests on a wooden rack, its skeleton exposed, one lonely four-cola jutting up like a question mark, sawdust on the ground, a workbench off to the side, cluttered with chisels and a tin of oil. Someone's humming, off-key and unhurried. The boats are designed for this kind of rowing, but not just in theory. The hull itself is slightly twisted, again, barely noticeable, so that the single oar balances the boat's weight. It leans ever so slightly to the right, compensating for the constant leftward push of the stroke, like a dance partner who already knows how you're going to move before you do. This twist is also where aesthetics and function collide, because if the boat weren't asymmetrical, rowing it from one side only would send it in circles, and nobody has time for that, not even in Venice. Even the gondolier's stance evolved, knees slightly bent, hips rotated, one foot a few inches ahead of the other. It looks casual, but it's incredibly specific. The motion isn't just back and forth, it's a kind of standing lunge that uses the whole body, not just the arms, and all this while avoiding tourist selfies, stray pigeons, and the occasional floating lemon peel. There's no ceremony in learning it, just time, mistakes, maybe a few damp shoes. But once it's mastered, the gondola obeys. It stops mid-glide. It turns with a tilt of the wrist. It threads through tight canals, like a thought whispering through a crowded room. And so you drift onward, quietly watching the one-oar dance unfold again and again across this watery cityscape, where every gondola moves with the strange calm confidence of something that was never meant to rush. You're gliding now past one of Venice's many side canals, so narrow it seems barely wider than your boat. And yet, you pass through effortlessly, not because you've become an expert navigator overnight, but because your gondola is subtly cheating. It's crooked, on purpose. You might not notice it at first glance, especially with the polished black paint and the quiet elegance of its long frame. But the modern gondola is not symmetrical. In fact, if you were to slice it lengthwise down the middle and examine the two halves, you'd see a subtle but deliberate curve toward the left. It's not much, a gentle lean, but enough to make purists nod approvingly, and tourists wonder why they keep turning ever so slightly rightward. This is not a mistake. This is how you solve a problem when your solution needs to be invisible. The gondola's asymmetry emerged over centuries, not through big announcements or boat design revolutions, but through minor complaints, quiet adjustments, and the slow, uncelebrated wisdom of people who spend their entire lives standing at the back of a boat with one oar. Here's the mainstream fact. The modern gondola is about 35.5 feet, roughly 10.8 meters long, and curves about 10 inches, 25 kilometers to the left, along its length. This gentle curve compensates for the gondolier standing on the right and rowing exclusively on the starboard side. Without it, the boat would slowly drift left with every stroke, requiring constant overcorrection. And let's be honest, Venetians are not big fans of extra effort. But here's the quirky bit no one really agrees on when this asymmetry became standardized. There are 16th century paintings showing gondolas that appear straight. Some 17th century sketches show odd angles and subtle leans, but no explanations. Gondola builders squarely rarely wrote things down. Their measurements were memorized, passed through generations like secret recipes. In fact, the earliest confirmed asymmetrical gondolas appear in Venice around the late 19th century. Before that, it's all a little ambiguous, possibly because the curves were too subtle to be documented or simply not noticed by chroniclers busy describing saints and civic rituals. The scholarly debate here is a particularly drowsy one. Did the asymmetry evolve gradually as boatmen made tiny adjustments based on feel? Or was there a decisive moment, maybe a single bold builder, who one day tilted the frame slightly and waited to see if anyone complained? Some argue it was deliberate engineering. Others say it was the byproduct of generations of wear and tear being mistakenly passed down as design. One theory, rather charming in its lack of evidence, suggests that asymmetric gondolas came about when builders began copying warped boats, boats that had slightly leaned from years of use, but still performed better than their newer, straighter cousins. So they recreated the curve, assuming it was a brilliant original feature. It wasn't. It was just wear. But it worked. You float by a square now. There's no sign, no advertisement, just a covered area of timber, the smell of varnish, and a half-finished gondola propped on wooden beams. It looks elegant already, but if you squint, you can see the tilt, barely perceptible, like the boat is caught mid-wink. A builder stands nearby, sipping something hot from a chipped cup. He's staring at the hull, not measuring, not taking notes, just staring, as if the answer to perfect balance will whisper itself to him if he's patient enough. This is how boats are made in Venice, not with specs and schematics, but with muscle memory and suspicion. Some squareroli will tell you they can feel whether a gondola is balanced by nudging it with their knee. Others claim the asymmetry is measured by eye and when pressed for details. They just shrug, and yet, despite the lack of standardization, nearly all gondolas are identical in length, width, and curvature today. It's a quiet marvel of oral tradition, instinctive engineering, and stubborn pride. One curious little detail, the gondola's curvature isn't just along the hull. Even the metal prow ornament, the faro, is shaped to subtly counterbalance the boat's off-kilter form. That heavy iron piece, which we'll get to more fully later, leans gently outward, helping restore symmetry in function, if not form. There's also balance in weight distribution. Gondoliers shift their stance as they row, adjusting their lean to keep the boat gliding straight. That's why you'll often see them moving around the stern, never locked into one posture. They're not restless, they're calibrating. This entire method, standing on one side, rowing in gentle arcs, adjusting by instinct, trusting a lopsided boat to glide perfectly straight, feels almost comical on paper. And yet, here in motion, it's seamless, quietly confident, like the boat and rower are sharing a joke that no one else hears. A tourist asks a gondolier once, "Isn't it hard to steer something that curves the wrong way?" The gondolier, who's been doing this since before the tourist had teeth, simply smiles and says, "No, the boat knows." That's not entirely untrue. One theory often floated by builders, again, rarely with citations, is that the slight asymmetry gives the gondola a sort of memory. Once in motion, it wants to continue in a straight line rather than veer or wobble. This helps on long stretches of canal, where correcting direction every few seconds would be tedious. It's as if the boat has developed its own habit of obedience. And that's the beauty of the gondola. Nothing loud, nothing showy. Every innovation, so subtle it seems accidental. Every adjustment so quiet it's practically hearsay. You lean back now, the boat gently rocking beneath you, and look up at a sky that's bluer than it should be. Considering the number of chimneys, the buildings lean in close, as if trying to hear your thoughts. The oar dips again, swirls, pulls. The boat moves forward, not despite being asymmetrical, but because of it. As you drift beneath another narrow bridge, its bricks weathered, its underside echoing the soft scrape of oar against water, you begin to notice something curious. Every gondola that glides past is painted black, not navy, not maroon, not even a cheerful canal green, just black, uniform, glossy, almost funereal, and it hasn't always been this way. In fact, centuries ago, gondolas were more flamboyant than a feathered mask at carnival. They sported gold leaf accents, brightly painted hulls, rich embroidered cushions, miniature flags, carved panels, family crests, and even painted ceilings in their tiny onboard cabins. These weren't just boats, they were status symbols, floating declarations of "look how unnecessary this is." But over time, Venice gently intervened. Here's the mainstream fact in the 17th century. The Venetian government enacted a series of sumptuary laws aimed at reducing the extravagant displays of wealth across the city. These laws didn't just cover clothing and parties, they extended to gondolas as well. And one of the results, a mandate that all gondolas be painted a uniform black to prevent ostentatious one-upmanship. Now, let's not imagine some grand confrontation between nobles and city officials. No powdered wig courtroom drama. The decree passed quietly. Gondola owners grumbled a bit. Painters sold a lot of tar-colored lacquer. And life went on. But what makes this even more fascinating is the strange little rumor that won't quite go away. Some believe the black gondola originated not with legislation, but with funerals. In earlier centuries, gondolas painted black were specifically used for transporting the deceased. The color became associated with formality and dignity. And then, slowly, subtly, that somber association seeped into mainstream fashion until all gondolas were black, regardless of occasion. Most historians roll their eyes at this theory, but they also can't completely disprove it, which leaves us floating in the calm waters of a scholarly maybe. The result, though, is undeniable today. Black is the rule, and there's a very particular kind of black used on gondolas, not matte, not flat, but a glossy, mirror-like sheen created by applying multiple layers of pitch and oil, then buffing until the surface reflects the ripples of the canal like glass. It's not just paint, it's tradition lacquered into place. Now, the oddity here isn't just the color, but how strictly it's been maintained, despite modern branding, tourism, and the global pressure to stand out. No commercial gondola in Venice is allowed to change this. You can't roll up in a neon blue model and expect to get business. You'll get fined. Or worse, shunned. But while the outside remains regulation black, the inside, that's where quiet rebellion takes place. Gondola interiors vary in upholstery, paneling, and cushion shape. Some use crimson velvet, others lounge toward navy brocade. There are golden tassels, hidden compartments, mirrored ceiling panels, and even custom embroidered initials, especially on privately owned gondolas. You pass one now. The gondolier barely glances up as his passengers, a quiet couple in linen hats, are lounging under a small canopy trimmed with scalloped silk inside the boat. The seat backs are carved with tiny birds. The floor is gleaming wood, inlaid with what looks like mother of pearl. No one says anything about it. No one needs to. The rules are simple. The hull stays black. What happens above the waterline, though, is between you and your boat builder. One lesser known detail: gondola paint isn't purely decorative, it's protective. Venice's canals are not the pristine aqua of postcards. They are saltwater, laced with the occasional oil slick, algae bloom, and fish guts. The thick black coating prevents the wooden hull from absorbing water and rotting prematurely. It's a functional finish disguised as aesthetic uniformity. You might be wondering, why hasn't this changed surely? With fiberglass, synthetic materials, and high-performance coatings, we don't need all that pitch anymore. True, technically, but gondola builders, the Squareroli, are not interested in upgrades that break tradition. In fact, most would rather retire than apply a color that wasn't time-honored black. This devotion is less about regulation and more about rhythm. The color is part of the gondola's identity, just like its curve, its length, or its single oar. There's a tiny whisper of protest among younger builders now and then. Someone suggests a matte finish, another jokes about a themed gondola for holidays. But these ideas tend to evaporate like mist by morning. Venice isn't particularly quick to modernize, and the gondola, by design, isn't built for speed. One fringe tidbit worth floating your way there was once a gondola painted entirely in silver for a royal wedding procession. Not local royalty, foreign passing through. It glimmered across the canal like a sardine made of mirrors, and afterward it was dismantled, not preserved, not paraded, taken apart quietly, as if Venice had briefly lost its mind and then quietly recovered. So as you float through this still water, remember this: every gleaming black hull you pass is not just a boat. Its compliance lacquered in centuries of tradition. The water swirls gently behind you now. The gondola rocks slightly with the shift of your weight. In the distance, another boat approaches, black and glossy, like a shadow cast by a city that knows exactly how it wants to look. The gondola beneath you doesn't creak. It sighs, just barely. The kind of sound that comes from polished wood, soft cushions, and a quiet sense of pride. And then you notice you're not sitting on a simple bench or plank like in most small boats. You're nestled into an actual chair, low-backed, cushioned, curved to cradle rather than command. There's no need to sit upright or steer or do anything but be welcome to the floating furniture phase of gondola evolution. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, gondolas weren't just practical, they were comfortable, and comfort, as every Venetian noble knew, was both a luxury and a declaration. This is where things get quietly decorative. Here's your mainstream fact. The enclosed cabin at the center of older gondolas is called a felze. Think of it as a mobile, miniature parlor room. It was enclosed on all sides, often with small glass windows, fabric curtains, and interior padding. Some were even equipped with tiny mirrors or lanterns. The idea wasn't just to shield passengers from the rain, it was to preserve privacy. That might sound romantic, but in reality, the felze was often used for very practical reasons. Venetian nobles held meetings while gliding through the canals. Lovers exchanged hushed promises or well rehearsed lies. Spies met clients. Mothers napped. Priests offered quiet counsel. And sometimes, people simply hid from their in laws. So, yes, the felze mattered by the 18th century. No respectable gondola would be caught without one. They varied by wealth and purpose, but the general idea remained if the gondola was your car. The felze was your tinted window. Now, the quirky bit, these little cabins could be removed in summer months. And during times of celebration, like carnival, they often were. This allowed for elaborate costuming and public displays of identity. But there were still rules even in flamboyant times. Your cushions had to match. Your curtains had to be drawn just so. And any over-the-top interior might draw sideways glances from the boat behind you. People often misunderstand Venice as a city of unchecked decadence. In truth, it was deeply concerned with moderation, at least in appearance. That's why so many decorations had to be removable. You could bring out the crimson embroidery and gold thread pillows for a wedding, but by Monday, it all went back into storage. This duality, lavishness under restraint, was woven into the gondola itself. The furniture was designed for low seating, which served two purposes. First, to lower the passenger's center of gravity, preventing the gondola from tipping, and second, to encourage a posture of leisure. No one slouches in a gondola by accident. The cushions subtly guide you to recline, to observe, not to act. Even the footrests were considered. Some gondolas had small ottoman-like platforms for resting your legs, not out of necessity, just civility. If your boots left marks on the floor, someone had to clean it, and if you arrived somewhere with dirty soles, people would talk, quietly, of course, but they would talk. There's a bit of scholarly disagreement about the exact layout of historical felze interiors. Paintings and records describe them differently. Some show side benches. Others show a single central bench with its armrests. A few sources even mention tiny writing desks or drop-leaf tables built into the walls, but physical examples are almost non-existent. The felze was made mostly of wood and fabric, materials that vanish over centuries like secrets after sunset. Today, the felze is largely gone. You'll see open-air gondolas now, outfitted with elegant seat cushions, striped blankets, and fold-down canopies, but not full enclosures. Tourists prefer the view, and modern regulations prioritize visibility and safety. Still, a few private gondolas maintain traditional felze replicas, mostly for ceremonial use. They slide through the fog like velvet-covered ghosts. And now for a fringe tidbit, there was once a gondola designed specifically for naps. It belonged to a wealthy spice trader who reportedly suffered from insomnia. He commissioned a specially insulated felze. lined with fur and equipped with a feather-stuffed headrest. The gondolier was instructed to row without speaking and to avoid any bridges where echoes might disturb the man's slumber. Whether or not it worked, unknown. But the boat became locally famous as Il Dormiente, the sleeper. Floating beds aside, the gondola's role as a mobile room never truly went away. Even now, people propose marriage in them, confess in them, complain about relatives in them. You recline a little further. The chair cushions don't creak. They yield. The gondolier shifts his weight. The boat barely notices. Nearby, another gondola passes. The seats are upholstered in forest green velvet, and a tiny brass oil lamp flickers near the footwell. The couple inside holds hands without speaking. Their gondolier wears dark gloves, not for warmth, but because they match the seat trim. There's a term Venetians used to describe a well-appointed gondola composta. It means composed, harmonious, like a room where every detail matches, not because of style, but because someone cared. So the next time you imagine a gondola, don't just picture the curve of its hull or the sweep of its oar. Think of the chairs, the fabric, the soft rug underfoot, the faint scent of polished wood, and maybe orange blossom from someone's perfume. Because long before these boats became photo ops, they were rooms that rocked gently on the water, letting you lounge your way through an otherwise inconvenient geography, and the city loved them for it, quietly, comfortably, with style you could sit on. The boat you're in now is, by all appearances, modest, polished black exterior, a few cushions inside, nothing garish, nothing golden. But that wasn't always the case. Once upon a less regulated time, gondolas glimmered. They shimmered with gold leaf. Their wooden panels were hand-carved with vines, lions, cherubs, and sometimes entire family crests. The Felze cabins sparkled with painted ceilings. Some gondolas even had embroidered canopies, their tassels swaying with every ripple. Each boat was an extension of its owner's ego. And then, Venice politely asked everyone to tone it down. Here's your mainstream fact by the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The Venetian Republic enacted increasingly strict leggi suntuari, sumptuary laws that limited public displays of wealth, including those involving gondolas. These laws were not just social, they were political. Venice had grown wary of its noble families, using gondolas to compete in opulence. Gold flourishes, inlaid gems, and elaborate sculptural work were seen as distractions from civic unity. So, the government decreed that all gondolas be stripped of their gaudy adornments. The hulls went black, as you've already seen, but more than that. The elaborate woodwork was banned. Even the pharaoh, the ornate iron prow, was eventually standardized, allowed to remain decorative, but within limits. This wasn't a sudden crackdown. It was slow, civil, delivered in the usual Venetian way, with bureaucratic grace and no shortage of loopholes. Which leads us to the quirky detail for this section for several decades. Noble families responded to the new restrictions not by giving up ornamentation, but by hiding it. Secret panels were added inside Felze cabins. Carvings were placed on the undersides of benches. Intricate embroidery was tucked inside armrests. From the outside, the gondola looked restrained. Inside, still indulgent. There's even a record of one noble family commissioning a painter to create a tiny ceiling fresco inside their felze. It featured a classical landscape, no larger than a dinner plate, positioned so only the seated passenger could see it. The fresco was invisible from the outside, which technically didn't violate the law. So, yes, the laws were followed, but always with a wink. The scholarly uncertainty in this section lies in the actual enforcement of these sumptuary laws. While the statutes exist, archived in lovely dry Latin, records of enforcement are scarce. Did inspectors row around the canals checking gondola trim? Did fines get handed out for overly exuberant seat cushions? No one's quite sure. Some suggest enforcement was reserved for public events, parades, ceremonies, diplomatic receptions. Others believe the laws were more symbolic than functional, aimed at signaling the Republic's values without actively policing boat upholstery. One thing we do know, gondola design became less about flair and more about silhouette. The clean black hull, the graceful prow, the elongated form. If you wanted to impress someone now, you did it with subtlety, the perfect polish, the quietest glide, the lightest touch at the oar. You pass a gondola now that gleams so evenly. It's like a single drop of oil floating on the surface. No carvings, no extra panels, just light, shadow, and the whisper of craftsmanship. But even here, style isn't dead. Gondoliers began to personalize in new, acceptable ways. A folded scarf here, a monogrammed blanket there. The design of the forcola, remember the sculpted oarlock from earlier, became a sight of quiet artistry. Some were carved to match the gondolier's height and reach. Others featured small flourishes, an extra curve, a sharp edge, a groove that echoed a family pattern. It was detail for detail's sake, but done in whispers. There's also a little known phenomenon from this period, the loaned embellishment. For special occasions, like weddings or diplomatic events, a gondola could temporarily be adorned with removable panels, crests, or flags. These accessories were passed between families, often hired like tuxedos. After the event, everything came off, and the boat returned to anonymous black. One gondola, belonging to a prominent 17th century merchant family, was known to have a detachable set of carved cherub panels, stored in a canal-side attic and only attached during carnival. A visitor once described the transformation as a boat dressing up as a cathedral, then shedding its robes to hide among the commoners. And yet, through all this adornment and shedding thereof, the gondola's shape never fundamentally changed. No matter how decorative it got, or how stripped down it became, the curve, the balance, the basic anatomy of the boat remained constant. It had to. The canals didn't change, and neither did the laws of water. The modern gondola is the result of centuries of this back and forth between expression and restraint. It is not flashy, but it's not plain either. It is composed, like the city itself. A canal breeze now brushes past you, somewhere nearby. A gondola disappears behind a corner, its edges catching the sunlight just enough to glint, then fading again into shadow. It doesn't need gold to shine. It never really did. Now your eye is drawn to the prow of your gondola, the front tip that gently curves upward, ending in an ornate iron ornament that looks oddly like a comb, or perhaps a rake turned poetic. This is the pharaoh, and if you ask 10 Venetians what it means, you'll get 15 answers, most of them conflicting, and none of them delivered in a rush. Let's start with the mainstream fact. The Ferro di Prua, or simply Ferro, is the iconic iron piece affixed to the bow of every gondola. It has been a standardized component since at least the 17th century. Structurally, it serves a simple purpose. It acts as a counterweight to the gondolier, whose weight at the stern needs balancing at the front for the boat to remain stable and level. But function, of course, only scratches the surface, because this is Venice, and in Venice, even the counterweights are symbolic. The Ferro has 6 forward-facing teeth, or bars, and a single rear-facing one. One commonly accepted interpretation is that the 6 teeth represent the city's 6 sestieri, or districts. The backward-facing tooth is said to represent the island of Giudecca, located across the canal. The curve of the Ferro is said to echo the Grand Canal itself, an elegant S shape, just like the waterway that cuts the city in two. Or perhaps it mimics a doge's ceremonial cap, or maybe it's meant to look like a stylized fish spine, or a sword, or simply a flourish added by an ironworker who liked symmetry more than metaphor. See, Venice likes its symbols with options. Here's the quirky bit. Some antique ferry have additional flourishes. Stars, initials, birds. In earlier centuries, they weren't all standardized, and builders or owners sometimes commissioned unique versions to stand out. One even had a tiny iron lion perched on top, which locals immediately dubbed Il Leoncino Ubriaco, the drunk little lion, because it leaned slightly to one side. Today, gondolas are required to have regulation ferry, forged from iron, weighing about 10 kilograms, 22 pounds. The design is now essentially universal, with minor variation allowed only for ceremonial boats or replicas. But even within this standard, the craftsmanship varies. Each Ferro is handmade, traditionally by local blacksmiths who specialize in curved ironwork. There are no machines involved, just fire, hammers, and a lot of shrugging. And this leads us to the quiet, scholarly debate. What did the original Ferro look like? And when did it start accumulating its symbolic interpretations? Some scholars argue that the earliest ferry were much simpler, just a straight bar or blunt ornament, and that the 6 teeth for 6 districts interpretation is a later invention, retrofitted onto a functional design. Others claim the symbolism was always there, just passed along verbally among gondoliers and smiths rather than written down. Still others wonder whether the entire symbolic system was created in the 20th century as part of Venice's growing effort to preserve and explain itself to tourists. The truth, we're not sure. The iron itself can't talk, and the documents are vague at best. But the Ferro continues to be treated with reverence. It's always polished, though always intact. You'll never see a gondola without one, even the most worn-out boat, waiting for repair in a side canal, will have its Ferro shined like a trophy. The gondolier rarely touches it. That's not superstition, it's just not part of their job. The Ferro is fixed in place, often during the final stage of gondola assembly. It is balanced, angled, and adjusted with quiet precision, because the boat's entire performance depends on it. Without the correct counterweight, the boat would lean back, making rowing inefficient and turning cumbersome. And yet, despite its importance, the Ferro is rarely the focus of attention. Tourists photograph it, yes, but gondoliers almost never mention it in their patter. It is like the punctuation in a sentence. You don't notice it until it's missing. One interesting fringe story during a festival in the early 1800s, a local blacksmith created a limited run of reverse ferry with the teeth facing backward as a sort of visual pun. The gondolas that bore them were part of a comedic parade, mocking bureaucratic inefficiency by literally facing the wrong way. None of these reversed ferries survive, but there's one blurry etching in an old civic archive that might depict them, or it might just be a smudged drawing. Opinions differ. You pass close to another gondola now, and you notice its pharaoh catching the late afternoon light. Its shape looks identical to yours, and yet something feels different. Perhaps the polish, or the weight distribution, or the subtle hand of the smith who forged it. There's a serenity in that curve, a promise that the boat will hold steady, that the ride will be smooth, that no matter how narrow the canal or how sudden the turn, this quiet piece of iron will help keep everything in balance. It is weight, transformed into elegance, a tool disguised as an emblem, a symbol that might mean everything or nothing at all. And Venice wouldn't have it any other way. You're gliding through one of Venice's mid-sized canals now, not the grand spectacle of the Grand Canal, nor the claustrophobic intimacy of the back alley waterways. This one feels like a compromise, wide enough for two gondolas to pass, narrow enough that sound still bounces gently off the walls. And yet, despite the number of boats slipping silently past, there's no traffic jam, no honking, no shouting gondoliers, no signs, no painted lanes, no one-way systems. The water flows, and the boats flow with it, as if by instinct. Which brings us to one of the gondola's quietest achievements, managing canal congestion without ever inventing a single stoplight. Let's start with the mainstream fact. By the 16th century, Venice was already regulating canal traffic, centuries before modern traffic systems were developed elsewhere. There were official rules about which side of the canal to row on the right, usually who had right of way at bridges those going upstream, and that even speed limits to prevent wakes from damaging buildings. Yes, speed limits for gondolas. Not that anyone was in a hurry, but still, they existed, and yet, despite these early traffic laws, enforcement was more about habit than police. Gondoliers, boatmen, barge workers, all learned from experience. The rhythm of the city taught them where to slow down, where to wait, and when to yield. Here's the quirky bit: gondolas have no brakes, no reverse gears, no warning bells. To slow down or stop, a gondolier shifts the oar into a braking stroke, dragging it gently through the water. To avoid a collision, they'll spin the blade perpendicular, sending the boat into a slow, controlled drift. To pass another boat, they'll shift their weight just enough to tilt the hull, letting the current guide them into a quiet lane of clearance. It's ballet, but performed by tired men in striped shirts. During rush hours, which, yes, exist even on water, gondoliers navigate through chaos by relying on centuries of passed down etiquette. You don't shout unless absolutely necessary. You don't splash. You acknowledge with a nod, if that. One unwritten rule: the more passengers you have, the more right of way you're given. A gondola full of tourists gets priority over a gondolier going solo to his next pickup. A boat carrying a bride has priority over everyone. A boat carrying fish, not so much. There are even quiet traditions for passing under bridges. If two gondolas approach from opposite sides and meet in the middle, the one traveling downstream often reverses with a backward stroke. But if one of the gondolas carries a musician or someone visibly elderly, the upstream boat might yield anyway. Again, none of this is written down anymore, but everyone knows. And that brings us to the scholarly uncertainty. Just how much of this was ever codified? Venice's archives contain scattered references to canal laws, edicts about wake damage, boat licenses, and approved hull lengths, but the majority of canal behavior appears to have evolved as custom rather than statute, which makes it remarkably durable, because no one enforces custom like a gondolier with a long memory and a sharp opinion. Some historians argue that 18th century gondoliers had more legal authority than modern ones. They acted as informal regulators, reporting unsafe barges, mediating dock disputes, even pointing out poorly constructed piers to local officials. Others believe their authority was purely social, the result of knowing every turn, bridge, and echo in the city. And here's a fringe detail in the 1700s. A small guild of canal whispers supposedly existed, men who would linger near bottleneck canals and quietly advise gondoliers on the best alternate routes. They weren't paid, they weren't official, but they earned favors, tips, and occasional baked goods. No one knows if this guild really existed, or if it was just a local joke, but it's been mentioned in at least 3 personal journals, none of which mention what the whispers actually whispered. Back in your journey, you approach a 3-way canal fork. Another gondola approaches from the left. You don't slow, you don't change direction. The gondolier adjusts his stance slightly, taps the water with a deft stroke, and you curve around each other like magnets repelling mid-glide. No need for eye contact, no tension, just trust. This is how Venice keeps from crashing into itself. It helps, of course, that gondolas are nimble. The flat bottom lets them pivot with very little resistance. The single oar allows for mid-stroke corrections, and the length, long enough to be stable, short enough to thread through tight spaces, means gondoliers can swerve gently without overcorrecting. Even the city's architecture helps. Canal walls are not symmetrical. They bow in slightly in some areas, offering just enough clearance. Some even bear the smooth patches of generations of boat hulls brushing past. These aren't dense, they're soft records of cooperation. You pass under another bridge now. A pedestrian walks above, clutching a paper bag and not bothering to look down. To them, boats passing beneath are part of the background. The gondola is not a spectacle here. It is simply the shape transportation takes. And yet, for all its seeming ease, this system works because it never pretended to be perfect. Gondoliers expect obstacles, expect delays, expect to nudge a wall occasionally, or backtrack when a shortcut turns out to be blocked by a delivery boat full of milk. There's no panic, no revving engine, just a quiet splash, a second attempt, and then onward, because in Venice, even traffic jams know how to wait their turn. The gondolier in front of you doesn't wear a name tag, no shiny badge, no laminated license on a lanyard, just a soft striped shirt, a neat black sash, dark trousers, and, of course, a straw hat with a ribbon that seems to catch the light more than the man wearing it. You've seen this look before, on postcards, in guidebooks, even in cartoons. The striped shirt gondolier has become so iconic that it's easy to assume someone, somewhere, must have designed it intentionally. They didn't. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. There is no official gondolier uniform. Not historically, not today, not even now. With tourism at its peak and gondoliers posing for thousands of photos a week, the look you're imagining, the stripes, the hat, the dark trousers, is traditional. Yes, but mostly out of habit and expectation rather than regulation. So, where did it come from? Well, that's a murky canal to paddle through. The earliest gondoliers, especially during the Renaissance and Baroque eras, wore what everyone else wore: loose trousers, tunics, heavy cloaks in winter. Some accounts even mention bare feet, especially in summer months. The idea was practicality rowing is hot work, and canals are wet places. By the 19th century, however, a more recognizable look began to emerge. Stripes, it seems, were favored because they were cheap, easy to sew from leftover sailcloth, and, incidentally, very good at hiding stains. A gondolier in a striped shirt could look presentable after a long shift, even if he'd just fended off a dozen splashes, a rainstorm, and a squashed tomato. The straw boater-style hat, too, wasn't originally Venetian. It was common summer wear for laborers and sailors throughout Italy. Gondoliers adopted it because it was breathable, durable, and inexpensive. The ribbon pure flair. Some gondoliers wore red, others blue. Over time, it became a quiet mark of personal style. But here's the quirky tidbit in the 1920s. During a tourism boom and a push to market Venice as a romantic destination, travel posters and silent films began to depict gondoliers in crisply striped shirts and hats. Tourists, charmed by the image, started expecting it in real life, and gondoliers, never ones to miss a good tip, leaned into the look. By the 1950s, it had become so ingrained that most gondoliers wore stripes by default, especially when working the Grand Canal or major tourist areas. It wasn't law, it was just smart business. But not everyone embraced it. Many local gondoliers, especially those working in quieter sestieri or transporting locals, preferred solid colors: dark button-up shirts and simple trousers, functional shoes. To them, the stripy look was a costume for outsiders. Real gondoliers didn't dress for the camera. And yet, over time, the image won. Today, most working gondoliers wear striped shirts as part of their regular attire, though usually only when on duty. Off duty, they dress like anyone else, often in a deliberate effort not to look like they've just stepped off a souvenir mug. There's even a quiet rivalry between stripe colors. Red striped shirts are traditionally considered more flamboyant, favored by those who work in busier tourist routes. Blue stripes are more reserved, supposedly more common among older gondoliers or those from deeply traditional families. Of course, none of this is codified, but ask around in the right squero and you'll get opinions. And here's the scholarly uncertainty: was the uniform ever proposed officially? Some sources suggest that, in the early 20th century, the city of Venice briefly considered regulating gondolier dress codes as part of a broader beautification campaign. Meeting notes from 1926 mention discussions about consistency in public-facing workers' appearance. But no formal dress code appears to have passed. If it did, sir, it was short-lived and gently ignored. The gondoliers themselves, organized under a historic guild system, have always valued autonomy. Their training is rigorous: apprenticeships, exams, navigation tests, and even foreign language requirements for modern licensing. But their clothing, that's theirs to choose. A fringe story in the 1970s. A gondolier named Paolo wore a completely white uniform for an entire summer. White trousers, white shirt, white sash. His gondola, too, was trimmed in white linen. Locals called him Il Fantasma, the ghost. He claimed it made him cooler in the heat. Others said he was protesting the striped cliché. Either way, he returned to blue stripes the next year. The tourists missed him too much. So here you are, passing a gondolier in the classic look, blue stripes, neatly pressed, hat tipped just enough to keep the sun out of his eyes. His boat is perfectly balanced. His oar barely makes a sound, and his expression neutral, perhaps even slightly amused, because style, in this city, is never loud. It's a murmur, a stripe, a tilt of a ribbon, a boat that doesn't need to shout because it knows exactly who it is. And if you asked the gondolier what he thought of all this, the history, the symbolism, the tourist fascination, he'd probably shrug and say, "Es solo una camiscia, it's just a shirt." You're leaning gently against the side of the gondola now, lulled by its predictable sway. When something shifts, barely, a subtle dip, a tilt to one side, nothing dramatic, but enough to remind you that gondolas aren't simply built to float. They're built to balance, and that balance isn't automatic. It's the result of hundreds of tiny, invisible choices. Let's begin with the mainstream fact. Modern gondolas are constructed to compensate for the gondolier's weight at the stern. Off to the starboard right side. That's right, not centered, not even close. The gondolier stands on a platform to one side, rowing from an elevated position, which means everything else in the boat must shift to restore equilibrium. And that's where the stern design, particularly its height and curve, starts to matter. Unlike flat-bottomed boats with symmetrical ends, gondolas feature an elevated stern that sweeps upward like a wave held in suspense. This isn't decorative, it's structural. The upward slope adds buoyancy to the back of the boat, offsetting the gondolier's weight. Meanwhile, the internal ribs of the hull are spaced unevenly. The left side is slightly longer. The right side is flatter, all of it engineered by instinct. It's asymmetry as tradition, not experiment. But here's the quirky bit: the degree of asymmetry isn't fixed. Gondola builders, known as squareroli, still rely on a mix of inherited measurement systems and tactile feedback. They don't use digital blueprints. They use wooden templates passed down through generations, sometimes marked with notches and initials. If one builder is taller than another, or prefers a certain stroke style, the curve might change slightly. One long-standing joke among gondoliers goes, "You can't steal someone's gondola. It won't row straight for you." It's not far from the truth. Many gondolas are subtly customized to their rower's weight, height, and rowing cadence. Even the seat placement for passengers adjusts the center of gravity, which brings us to the scholarly uncertainty: how standardized are modern gondola specs? Really? While most are roughly 11 meters long and about 1.4 meters wide, measurements vary slightly between squarey. Attempts have been made to codify gondola construction, particularly in the late 20th century, but most builders still treat their methods as personal, even secretive. Some believe this secrecy is protective, a way to keep mass production at bay. Others argue it's simply practical. Gondola building isn't a profession, it's a relationship. You don't just make a boat, you make this boat for that gondolier. And the moment you try to standardize everything, you lose the human balance that makes each one unique. There's an interesting fringe detail here. Some squareroli reportedly test the boat's balance, not with instruments, but by rowing it themselves, alone, at dusk. They listen to the water line. They feel the drag. They make minute adjustments with planers and shims, sanding a bit here, raising a board there, until the gondola no longer resists its own motion. It's called quieting the boat, and it's never done with an audience. You're not imagining the sensation now. The soft, rightward lean, the subtle tilt when your gondolier moves. It's intentional. The boat shifts with him, not against. When he turns, the rear of the gondola dips slightly, and the front follows with grace, not lurch. It's an unspoken contract between wood, water, and human. Even the gondola's keel, or lack thereof, is part of the equation. Remember, it's flat-bottomed, but not flat like a pancake, flat like a book that's been gently bent. The hull features a very shallow V shape beneath the waterline. This allows for both stability and agility. Too flat, and the boat would skid. Too curved, and it would tip. Gondolas ride the line between the two. And what about the materials? That's balance, too. A traditional gondola uses up to 8 different types of wood: oak for strength, larch for elasticity, lime and poplar for lightness, elm for the ribs, mahogany for shine, each chosen for its weight, grain, and flexibility, not for poetry, but for proportion. The boat, when finished, must weigh around 350 kilograms, 770 pounds unladen. It must sit low enough to remain stable in wind, but high enough to pass over the occasional submerged step or eel. The final balancing act involves not just construction, but aging. New gondolas often spend weeks or months in the water before they're considered fully tuned. They soak, they swell, they settle. You pass a squareo now, one of the older ones. A gondola leans on wooden supports, one side lifted slightly higher than the other. A craftsman with a half-lit cigarette is watching, not measuring, not sanding, not speaking, just watching, every so often. He taps the side with a knuckle, then listens, not for sound, for feel, balance, it turns out, isn't symmetry, not here. It's understanding where to lean, where to add weight, where to trust the water, where to nudge back. It's a bit like Venice itself, built on thousands of uneven wooden pilings, all of which quietly agree to keep standing, even when logic says otherwise. You glance at your gondolier now. His feet are offset, one higher than the other. His hips angled, his wrist making constant micro-adjustments. And the boat. The boat listens, because in Venice, stability isn't about stillness. It's about motion that doesn't argue with itself. Your gondola now floats through a quieter district, one of those canals not listed in guidebooks, where laundry still hangs between windows and the echo of footsteps above reminds you that Venice is somehow still lived in. But if you follow the curve of the canal just a little farther, you'll come upon something nearly hidden, a boatyard, low roofed, timber framed, and surprisingly silent. This is a scarrow, and this quiet, unassuming, even a little damp, is where gondolas are born. Not mass produced, not laser cut, not even uniformly blueprinted. Every gondola is made by hand, from memory, and shaped by conversations that mostly happen in silence. Here's your mainstream fact: Venice has only a few working squarey left. Historically, there were dozens scattered across the city, but today, only a handful remain in active use. The most famous of these is the Squero di San Trovaso, which has been crafting and repairing gondolas for centuries, unlike the grand architecture of nearby churches or palazzi. The Squero doesn't show off. It looks like a carpenter's shed, usually. It sits near water, tilted slightly into the canal, with a sloping ramp that allows boats to slide in and out. There are no signs, no tours, just tools, wood, varnish, and patience. The people who work here are not performers. They're artisans. Gondola builders, squareroli, are few, and their apprentices even fewer. Most have been doing this since youth, or are trained by a father, uncle, or sometimes a fiercely quiet neighbor. And here's the quirky part: gondola building is one of the few trades in Venice that still functions largely outside written instruction. There are no step-by-step manuals. Measurements are marked on long wooden batons called template sticks, often carved with notches, initials, and mysterious shorthand. Some of these templates are over 100 years old and used by builders who never met the original craftsman. Imagine tracing someone's handwriting by carving their sentence into wood and then building a boat out of it. A traditional gondola takes about 400 hours to build, not including finishing, balancing, and water testing. It begins with the scalmo, or backbone, a curved keel laid out in precise asymmetry. From there, ribs are added, then the deck, then the distinctive upward sweep of bow and stern. Each plank is shaped by hand, steamed, bent, and fixed with wooden pegs. Metal is used sparingly. And here's where scholarly uncertainty creeps in. While the overall shape of the gondola has remained stable for at least 2 centuries, no one can say precisely when or how this final perfect form was agreed upon. Some believe it emerged gradually in the 1800s. Others point to 20th century refinements. Even among current builders, there are small disagreements about the ideal ratio of width to length, or how much curve to add to the port side. Each squero does it slightly differently, and most builders won't tell you why. They'll smile, nod politely, maybe offer you a glass of something murky in a chipped cup. But if you ask for schematics, they'll shrug and gesture toward the water, as if that's where the blueprints went. This leads us to a fringe anecdote during a restoration effort in the 1970s. An American academic attempted to catalog gondola construction techniques for a dissertation. He visited 3 different squeri, asked dozens of questions, took hundreds of photographs, and in the end, his thesis was rejected, not because it lacked research, but because, as one advisor put it, he studied the gondola like it was a machine, but it's a conversation, and that's the truth of the squero. Every gondola built here reflects a dialogue between builder and water, between apprentice and elder, between the boat and the city it must navigate. These boats don't emerge from factories. They emerge from hours of adjusting weight by feel, of eyeballing a curve until it looks right, of sanding a rail until it stops catching the edge of a palm. Inside the squareo, you might find a wall lined with tools that haven't changed in centuries, chisels, clamps, tiny planes carved from olive wood. There are barrels of varnish made from secret recipes, planks of walnut or larch leaning patiently in corners, and somewhere, half hidden under a tarp, a forcola, that sculpted oarlock, awaits its final sanding. You may also see a gondolier waiting, hat in hand, watching his future boat take shape. Sometimes he's commissioned it, other times it's assigned. Either way, there's a quiet tension. The boat will be part of him. He'll spend more time with it than with most relatives, and he wants it to be right. You glide past the squareo now. A builder waves once, then turns back to a hull, tapping it gently with the back of a mallet. Somewhere inside that curve is a whisper he's trying to hear, because the gondola isn't just built, it's tuned. You drift along a canal that's broader than most, passing stately facades that once hosted dignitaries, minor royalty, and people who considered powdered wigs a necessity. Your gondolier doesn't change pace. The oar glides. The boat listens. But you notice something subtle. The cushions have been fluffed. The metal fittings gleam just a bit brighter. Because this gondola, like many before it, was made for someone important. Venice wasn't just a city of merchants and artists. It was a city of messengers, a crossroads, a port where political power arrived by water, accompanied not by fanfare, but by polished wood, velvet seating, and a very practiced silence. Let's begin with the mainstream fact throughout its history. The Venetian Republic used gondolas not only for everyday transport, but also for formal receptions, state visits, and diplomatic ceremonies. Visiting ambassadors, foreign royals, and even popes were often ferried through the canals in customized gondolas, accompanied by entourages and often music. These gondolas were not your standard black lacquered models. They were ceremonial vessels, larger, more ornate, and sometimes equipped with musicians or elaborate cabins. Some had canopies embroidered with the Doge's seal. Others featured removable flags or family crests attached to small poles just above the prow. But Venice being Venice, even its grandest gestures were restrained, unlike the Baroque processions of Paris or Rome. Venetian protocol favored elegance over extravagance. A ceremonial gondola might be richly appointed, but still quiet, still narrow, still built to pass under bridges without needing a round of applause. The most famous of these ceremonial gondolas was the Bucentoro, the Doge's state barge, larger than a gondola. It was used once a year for the marriage of the sea ceremony, an elaborate ritual in which the Doge symbolically wedded the Adriatic by tossing a ring into the water. But outside of that spectacle, even the Doge traveled by standard gondola, slightly better appointed perhaps, but quiet. Here's the quirky bit in certain periods. Special gondolas were rented out to foreign dignitaries, not just for transport, but for full-day itineraries. These rentals came with a gondolier trained in protocol, someone who knew not to speak unless addressed, who rode with particular precision, and who could identify the city's notable buildings without sounding like a tour guide. Some of these gondoliers even received temporary titles, servo di Stato, or servant of the state while working diplomatic duty. One such gondolier, Pietro Malvasia, was reportedly known for his ability to guide the boat with perfect stillness, so much so that nobles claimed they could write letters in ink without spilling a drop. Whether or not that's true, his name does appear in the margin of several 18th century guest books from visiting delegations, not as a curiosity, as a compliment. And this leads us to the scholarly uncertainty. Were these diplomatic gondolas fundamentally different in structure, or simply dressed up versions of standard models surviving records are vague? We know that ceremonial gondolas had larger cabins, but their hulls appear similar in dimension. Some believe the key difference was in the interior furnishings, temporarily added for state functions and then removed. Others think specific molds or hulls may have been used exclusively for high-ranking passengers. But in typical Venetian fashion, the truth was probably both, and neither. Gondolas were versatile. They adjusted. There's a fringe anecdote worth floating here in 1763 during a visit from a bored French envoy. His assigned gondola was equipped with a foot-operated bell system so he could summon wine, information, or supposedly a joke. The bell rang back to a second boat behind his, containing staff, books, and extra slippers. The setup was quietly discontinued after he fell asleep mid-summons and woke up confused by a gondolier holding grapes. And that's the thing about gondolas. They were dignified, yes, but never too impressed with themselves. You float past a palazzo now. The windows are shuttered, but once they opened for an Austrian princess, a Portuguese ambassador, a reluctant Bavarian archduke who mostly just wanted to sketch buildings in peace. All of them ferried through these canals by gondolas that didn't fanfare, didn't trumpet, didn't pose. They just moved. Because that's what gondolas do. They carry. They absorb. They reflect. They don't draw attention. They distribute it. Even the seating arrangement for state gondolas followed this logic. The highest-ranking passenger sat at the center of the boat, the point of greatest stability. Secondary guests flanked either side, but always behind, never ahead. A single lantern might be used for nighttime processions, but it was shielded, not displayed. The boat's profile had to remain low, unassuming, elegant. It was protocol by posture, diplomacy by design, and through it all, the gondolier remained standing, silent, one hand on the forecola, steering his long, curved boat through the ripples of politics, alliances, and boredom. You watch one now, not a ceremonial model, just a sleek black gondola gliding under a bridge. But there's something in the way the gondolier stands, so balanced, so measured, that you imagine he could carry a queen without shifting pace. Because in Venice, even royalty travels by rhythm, not parade. You hear a soft putter echo through the canal, not from your boat. Of course, your gondola remains blissfully motor-free, like every other in this stretch of quiet water. But that sound, it's coming from a small utility boat nearby, likely hauling produce or replacement chair legs to a restaurant. And it makes you wonder, why haven't gondolas given in to engines after all? Boats today can have electric motors, silent ones, lightweight ones, ones that wouldn't disturb the serenity of the canals or drip oil into the water. And yet, gondolas stay stubbornly manual, powered not by gas, but by rhythm and breath. Let's start with the mainstream fact. Gondolas have remained manually rowed vessels in a city that otherwise adopted motorboats for nearly every other type of water transport. Water ambulances, taxis, cargo barges, trash boats, all powered by engines now, but gondolas still steered by a single oar, still gliding forward at the pace of a walking man. Why, a few reasons. The official reason is tradition. Venice considers the gondola a living symbol of its heritage, protected by law, regulated by guilds, and maintained by master craftsmen. Introducing engines would compromise the cultural and aesthetic value of the gondola. It would break the spell. But here's the quieter truth: it just wouldn't work that well. Gondolas are long, narrow, and incredibly shallow. They rely on balance, finesse, and micro adjustments in water depth and direction. Add an engine, especially a rear mounted one, and the stern would sink disproportionately, making steering impossible. Even small electric motors, if mounted improperly, would throw off the delicate equilibrium that gondoliers constantly fine tune with each shift of weight. Plus, the canals themselves are unpredictable. Water levels rise and fall. Debris floats beneath the surface. The ability to stop on a dime by angling a wooden oar is something no motor can replicate. It's not speed that matters in Venice, it's control. Now for the quirky bit in the early 20th century, during a short-lived flirtation with modernization. A few inventors did try to create engine-powered gondolas. One eccentric nobleman had a gasoline gondola built for his personal use. It reportedly vibrated so much that he couldn't drink tea on board. The experiment was quietly abandoned. There's also an infamous patent from 1931 for a pedal-powered gondola, complete with rotating paddle wheels and a small canopy. It never saw production. The lone prototype reportedly sank while being shown off near San Marco. No one was hurt, except maybe the inventor's pride. So while engines became standard in nearly every other boat on the lagoon, the gondola remained a holdout, not just because of nostalgia, but because it was never designed for power. It was designed for precision, and it's very difficult to mechanize precision that depends on intuition. This brings us to the scholarly debate. Is there ever a future where motorized gondolas might make sense, perhaps for accessibility or environmental reasons? Some argue yes. Battery-powered propulsion is already used in modern ferries elsewhere, and in theory, a small, center-mounted thruster could be engineered to preserve balance. But traditionalists push back hard. They argue that rowing is not just propulsion. It's part of the gondolier's art, part of what makes the experience unique. Without it, a gondola becomes just another boat. There's also the guild to consider. Gondoliers must pass rigorous licensing exams that include navigation, rowing, language skills, and even historical knowledge. Removing the rowing element would strip away a fundamental part of their identity, not to mention undermine centuries of expertise. And then there's the fringe detail in 1999, during a quiet protest against a proposed expansion of engine-powered tourist services. A group of gondoliers rode in silent procession past City Hall, wearing suits and bowler hats. Their message that elegance needs no fuel. The press barely covered it, but among Venetians, it became a small legend. Today, some gondolas do use a bit of technology. A few have hidden radios, used to coordinate pickups or receive messages from nearby gondoliers. Some even carry small electric fans in summer months, mounted discreetly behind the felze or beneath the seat, but propulsion, still by oar, always by oar. You pass a gondolier now steering with one hand, sipping from a bottle of cold water with the other. He's not winded, not struggling, just adjusting the blade every few seconds, maintaining forward motion with the same ease as breathing. That's the essence of the gondola steady, uninterrupted movement. You're not racing, you're arriving. Venetians often say the city teaches you how to move. Fast walking doesn't help when there are no straight paths. Running just means getting lost sooner. And motorized impatience. It bounces off stone walls like noise in a cathedral. The gondola, then, isn't resistant to change out of stubbornness. It simply hasn't found a reason to evolve, not because it's perfect, but because its imperfections, the sway, the lean, the slowness, are exactly what make it beloved. So the next time you hear that quiet swish, know that you're hearing something not improved by speed, not made better by efficiency. You're hearing water yielding to rhythm, which, in Venice, is the only engine that ever mattered. The canal you glide through now feels softer, narrower, not in measurement, but in mood. The buildings lean just a little more. The echoes sound more distant. The colors turn duskier, terracotta fading into blue-gray, wrought iron balconies casting longer shadows. The gondola rocks gently, but your body no longer reacts. It simply adjusts. This is the end of the journey, not the dramatic kind, not the type with music or applause, just a gentle coast to stillness. Like most things in Venice, the ending arrives with a shrug and a whisper. Let's begin with our final mainstream fact, the gondola's basic design, its curvature, proportions. Asymmetry hasn't significantly changed since the late 1800s. It has been so finely tuned to its purpose and its place that any major redesign feels unnecessary. And so, its evolution continues not in revolutions, but in subtleties. A millimeter here, a curve smoothed there. Today's gondolas are still made almost exactly as they were over a century ago by hand, by memory, by people who consider chisels to be extensions of their own intentions. Some materials have shifted, epoxies used in place of old resin blends, or solar lanterns instead of oil, but the silhouette remains untouched. It would still be familiar to a 17th century doge, or a 14th century fishmonger, or a gondolier from last week. But here's the quirky final detail despite this devotion to tradition. Some gondolas today are being quietly modified for new purposes, not changed in shape, but in usage. You'll find wedding gondolas with hidden sound systems, floating libraries on special event days, and even a gondola once used as a small, drifting art installation, its hull painted with poems that only appeared when wet. One was called Barca della Pioggia, Boat of the Rain. And that's what the gondola has become, not a relic, but a canvas. It absorbs new purposes without giving up its form. As for the scholarly uncertainty that wraps it all up, well, that depends on who you ask. Some argue the gondola has reached its final form, a perfected vessel locked in time. Others believe the boat will continue to adapt, perhaps more dramatically, when faced with rising tides, shifting tourism demands, or future environmental laws. But for now, the boat holds, just like the city. You pass under one last bridge now. It's low, the kind you might duck beneath, though the gondolier doesn't. He's done this before, 1,000 times. You feel the shade pass over your head like a slow blink. Then light returns, and the boat eases into a small turning basin, the kind where movement seems to pause of its own accord. The buildings around you reflect in the canal, but they shimmer slowly now, not like ripples, more like sighs. The water settles, and so do you. Let your attention soften now. The rhythm of the oar has slowed. The gondolier stands still at the back of the boat, resting one hand lightly on the handle, letting the boat drift. He's not in a hurry. Neither are you. Around you, Venice doesn't sleep. It sighs. A cat pads across a windowsill overhead. A shutter creaks, not from wind, but from memory. The scent of stone, warmed by the day, still lingers, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marks the hour, but not loudly, just enough to remind you that time is still passing. Even here, the gondola floats now with no destination. You aren't arriving anywhere, and no one is waiting. The water carries you not forward, but gently inward and toward rest, toward release. Your breath matches the motion of the boat. In, pause, out, pause. The weight in your limbs is not heaviness, it's permission. You've looked, learned, drifted, and now you're allowed to stop. Let your thoughts scatter like reflections, soft, incomplete, and not needing to be gathered again. You don't need to know the next turn in the canal. You don't even need to know where you are, only that the boat hasn't tipped, the water hasn't argued, and the oar has stopped moving. There's nothing left to do, just this stay still as the gondola settles into the night, and the silence around you deepens like a blanket drawn just to the chin. Good night, gondolier. Good night, Venice. Good night, you